The crackling roar of flames devouring timber echoed through Rawhide, Nevada, as Marianne Turner stumbled backward through the smoke-filled interior of the lumber mill, her lungs screaming for clean air while orange tongues of fire licked at the wooden beams above her head. It was June 1882, and what had started as an ordinary afternoon of delivering her father's accounting ledgers had turned into a nightmare when a lantern toppled during an argument between two mill workers, igniting sawdust that exploded like gunpowder across the factory floor. She pressed her apron against her mouth, eyes watering so badly she could barely see the doorway she had entered through just minutes before, now completely engulfed in a wall of flame that seemed to breathe and pulse with malevolent life. Her father owned the general store 3 buildings down, and Marianne had been making these deliveries since she turned 18 2 years ago, always finding the mill fascinating with its massive saws and the smell of fresh cut pine. Now that same pine was fuel for an inferno that threatened to consume her along with the building. She tried to remember the layout, turning toward where she thought a back entrance might be, but the smoke was so thick it was like moving through a black curtain. Her foot caught on something, a fallen beam perhaps, and she went down hard on her knees, the impact sending jolts of pain through her legs. Above her, a terrible groaning sound warned of structural failure. Marianne looked up to see a section of the roof beginning to sag, glowing embers raining down like hellish snow. This was how she would die, she thought with sudden clarity. 20 years old with so much life unlived, so many dreams of leaving this dusty Nevada town and seeing San Francisco or maybe even traveling back east to New York. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and her father would be alone, and this seemed terribly unfair, but there was nothing she could do as her strength failed, and the smoke filled her lungs and darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Then she heard boots pounding on wood, heavy and fast, and a voice shouting something she could not make out through the roar of the fire. Strong hands grabbed her under the arms, lifting her like she weighed nothing at all, and she felt herself pressed against a solid chest as whoever had found her began moving through the inferno. She tried to speak, to ask who was saving her, but her throat would not work. The heat intensified for a moment, so fierce she was certain they would both burn, and then suddenly there was cool air on her face, and she was being laid down on packed earth while people shouted and someone poured water over her face and chest. Marianne coughed violently, her whole body convulsing as she tried to expel the smoke from her lungs. When her vision finally cleared enough to see, she found herself staring up at a man she had never seen before, his face streaked with soot and ash, his dark eyes filled with concern as he knelt beside her. He wore dusty leather chaps over denim trousers, a brown vest over a shirt that had once been white, and a black hat hung down his back by its cord. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with strong features and dark hair that fell past his collar, and even through her disorientation, Marianne noticed the way he looked at her, as though she were something precious he had nearly lost. "You are alive," he said, and his voice was rough, probably from the smoke. "Can you breathe? Does anything feel broken?" She managed to shake her head, though her throat burned and her chest ached. "Who are you?" "Zachary Zimmerman," he said, sitting back on his heels but keeping one hand on her shoulder as though afraid she might disappear. "I was riding past when I saw the smoke. Got here just as people started running out and someone said there was still a woman inside." Behind him, the mill continued to burn, the volunteer fire brigade working frantically with their hand pumps and bucket lines, though it was clear the building was lost. Marianne's father pushed through the crowd, his face pale with terror, and dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms with such force it hurt her bruised ribs. "Marianne, thank God, thank God," Robert Turner kept repeating, his voice breaking. He looked over her head at Zachary. "You saved my daughter's life. I do not have words to thank you properly." Zachary stood, his expression uncomfortable with the attention. "Any man would have done the same, sir." "But you are the one who did it," Marianne's father insisted. He was a portly man in his 50s with graying hair and the soft hands of a shopkeeper, and the contrast between him and the lean, weathered cowboy could not have been more stark. "Please, you must let me repay you somehow. Money, supplies, anything you need." "No payment necessary," Zachary said firmly. He looked down at Marianne one more time, and their eyes met and held. Something passed between them in that moment. Something Marianne could not name but felt deep in her chest. A connection forged in fire and smoke, and the terrible intimacy of near death. Then he touched the brim of his hat, turned and walked toward where a paint horse waited patiently at the hitching post across the street. Over the next 3 days, while Marianne recovered from the smoke damage to her lungs and the bruises that painted her arms and legs in shades of purple and yellow, she could not stop thinking about the cowboy who had pulled her from the flames. She learned from asking around town that he was new to Rawhide, having arrived about a month ago from Wyoming, and that he had hired on as a ranch hand at the Copper Creek Ranch about 5 miles south of town. No one knew much about him beyond that, though the clerk at the Silver Dollar Saloon mentioned he was quiet, paid his tab on time, and never caused trouble. Marianne told herself it was natural to be curious about someone who had saved your life. She told herself the fluttering in her stomach when she thought of his dark eyes was just a symptom of the trauma she had experienced. But she knew she was lying to herself. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel seen in a way she never had before, and she wanted desperately to see him again. Her opportunity came on Saturday when her father asked her to take the wagon out to the Copper Creek Ranch to deliver supplies that the ranch owner, Samuel Donovan, had ordered. Normally, one of the store's workers would make such deliveries, but Marianne volunteered immediately, ignoring her father's raised eyebrows. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her best day dress in deep blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and pinned her dark blonde hair up in a style that took her twice as long as usual. The ride out to the ranch took nearly an hour, the wagon wheels kicking up dust from the dry Nevada dirt. It was early July now, and the heat was oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned the distant mountains into wavering mirages. Marianne was sweating by the time she reached the ranch gates, and she worried her careful appearance had been ruined. The Copper Creek Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of high desert, with the main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings arranged around a central yard, where a few scraggly cottonwood trees provided precious shade. She pulled the wagon up to the main house, and a Mexican woman in her 40s came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. This was Rosa, the ranch cook and housekeeper, who smiled warmly and directed Marianne to take the supplies around back to the kitchen entrance. As Marianne was unloading crates of flour and sugar and canned goods, she heard male voices and the sound of horses, and her heart began to race. A group of ranch hands rode into the yard, dusty and tired from whatever work they had been doing. Marianne recognized Zachary immediately, riding slightly apart from the others on his paint horse. He wore the same type of clothes as before, practical working gear for a cowboy, and his hat was pulled low against the sun. When he dismounted and turned toward the main house, he froze, seeing her standing by the wagon, for a long moment, They simply looked at each other across the dusty yard. Then Zachary handed his horse's reins to another ranch hand and walked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance. Marianne's mouth went dry and she became acutely aware of how disheveled she must look after the hot wagon ride. "Miss Turner," he said when he reached her and removed his hat, revealing sweat-dampened hair. "I did not expect to see you up and about so soon. You should be resting." "I am quite recovered, thank you," Marianne said, and was pleased her voice came out steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. My father tried, but you left so quickly." Zachary looked uncomfortable again, the same expression he had worn when her father had tried to pay him. "Like I said, any man would have done the same thing." "But many men would not have," Marianne countered. "The workers who were arguing when the lantern fell, they ran out immediately." "You ran in. That makes you different whether you want to admit it or not." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first expression beyond concern or discomfort she had seen from him. "You are very insistent on making me out to be a hero." "Because you are one," she said simply. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "I would like to repay you somehow. Perhaps I could make you dinner. Nothing fancy, just a home-cooked meal to say thank you. Tomorrow evening, if you are free." The smile grew a bit wider. "Are you asking me to court you, Miss Turner?" Marianne felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Nevada sun. "I am asking you to dinner. What happens after that, well, I suppose we will have to see." He studied her for a long moment, and Marianne had the sense he was weighing something important, making a decision that went beyond just accepting or declining a meal. Finally, he nodded. "I would like that very much. What time should I come to town?" They settled on 6 o'clock the following evening, and Marianne drove the wagon back to Rawhide with a smile on her face that she could not suppress no matter how much she tried to be practical and sensible about the whole thing. She barely knew this man. He was a drifting cowboy with no apparent roots, and she was a shopkeeper's daughter with a respectable position in the small community. Her father would likely have opinions about her spending time with a ranch hand, no matter how heroic he might be. But none of that seemed to matter when she remembered the way Zachary had looked at her, like she was something worth risking his life for. Her father did indeed have opinions, which he shared that evening over dinner. "Marianne, I am grateful to Mr. Zimmerman, truly I am, but you must be careful about encouraging the attentions of a man like that." "A man like what?" Marianne asked, keeping her voice level. "A man who saved my life, a drifter," her father said, not unkindly. "These cowboys, they come and go with the seasons. They are not the marrying kind, not the kind to settle down and build a life with. I want more for you than that." Marianne set down her fork with deliberate care. "I am 20 years old, father. I am just inviting him to dinner to say thank you. I am not marrying him." But even as she said it, she felt the lie of it. There was something about Zachary Zimmerman that called to something deep inside her, something wild and restless that she had never acknowledged before. She had been a good daughter all her life, helping in the store, keeping house for her father, attending church socials, and politely declining the advances of the few eligible men in town. But none of them had ever made her feel the way she had felt looking across that dusty ranch yard at the cowboy, who had carried her through fire and smoke. The next day she spent hours preparing dinner, making fried chicken and biscuits and green beans with bacon, a peach cobbler for dessert made from canned peaches her father sold in the store. She set the table in the small dining room of their living quarters above the store, using her mother's good china that rarely came out of the cabinet. Her father stayed downstairs to mind the shop, making his disapproval clear through his absence. Zachary arrived exactly at 6, and Marianne found herself breathless at the sight of him cleaned up, He had clearly made an effort, wearing pressed trousers and a white shirt with a string tie, his dark hair slicked back and his jaw freshly shaved. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that he must have picked on the ride into town, and he presented them to her with an awkward formality that she found utterly charming. "These are beautiful," she said, taking the flowers and feeling absurdly pleased. "Come in, please. Dinner is ready." They sat across from each other at the small table, and for a few minutes there was an awkwardness between them as they served food and made small talk about the weather and the town. But gradually, as the meal progressed, they began to relax into easier conversation. Marianne asked about his work at the ranch, and Zachary described his days breaking horses and mending fences and moving cattle from one pasture to another. He had a way of telling stories that brought his experiences to life, and she found herself laughing at his description of a particularly stubborn bull that had led him on a chase across 3 miles of rangeland. "What brought you to Nevada?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You said you came from Wyoming." Zachary's expression grew more guarded. "My family had a small ranch up there. My father died 3 years ago, and my mother passed this last winter. I have a brother who wanted to keep the place going, but I needed to be somewhere else for a while." "Too many memories, I suppose." Marianne reached across the table and touched his hand, a brief gesture of sympathy. "I am sorry for your losses. I lost my mother when I was born. It is just my father and me. That must have been hard growing up without her." "You cannot miss what you never had," Marianne said, though it was not entirely true. She had always felt her mother's absence, especially at moments when other girls had their mothers to guide them. "My father did his best, but I think he always felt guilty, like he should have been able to be both parents to me." They talked for hours, the food growing cold on their plates, forgotten as they discovered all the small details that make up a person's life. Zachary told her about growing up on the Wyoming ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the brutal winters and the endless work. Marianne told him about life in Rawhide, about the characters who came through the store, about her dreams of seeing more of the world beyond this dusty Nevada town. "Why do you stay if you want to leave?" Zachary asked. "My father needs me," Marianne said simply. "After the fire, I realized how fragile everything is. He is not young anymore. What if something happened to him and I was not here? That is a heavy weight to carry, being responsible for someone else's happiness." "Is that not what love is?" Marianne asked. "Choosing to carry the weight of another person's well-being." Zachary looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think real love is 2 people carrying the weight together, so neither one has to bear it alone." The words hung in the air between them, pregnant with meaning beyond the surface level. Marianne knew they were no longer talking just about her relationship with her father, but about something else, something forming between the two of them in this small dining room above a general store in a nowhere Nevada town. When Zachary finally left, well past 9 o'clock, he paused at the door and took both of her hands in his. "May I see you again, Marianne? Not because you feel you owe me anything, but because I would very much like to spend more time with you." "I would like that too," she whispered. He lifted one of her hands to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that seemed almost courtly coming from a rough cowboy. Then he settled his hat on his head and walked down the stairs to where his horse waited, and Marianne stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared into the darkness. Over the following weeks, Zachary came to town every Sunday, the one day the ranch hands were given off from work. He and Marianne would walk through Rawhide together, a respectable distance apart but close enough that their hands sometimes brushed, sending electric jolts up Marianne's arm each time. They would sit together at church, sharing a hymnal, and have lunch at the small restaurant near the train depot. In the afternoons, they would ride out into the desert, Marianne on a gentle mare from the livery stable and Zachary on his paint horse, and find shady spots near springs where they could talk for hours about everything and nothing. Marianne learned that Zachary had a quiet strength to him, a sense of being completely comfortable in his own skin that she envied. He never tried to be anything he was not, never put on airs or pretended to knowledge he did not have. When he did not know something, he said so plainly. When he made a mistake, he admitted it without defensiveness. This honesty was refreshing after a lifetime of dealing with people who always seemed to be performing, trying to present the best version of themselves rather than the true version. For his part, Zachary seemed fascinated by Marianne's mind. She was well read, having spent countless hours in the store's small selection of books, and she had opinions on everything from politics to literature to the proper way to make biscuits. He would listen to her talk with complete attention, asking questions that showed he genuinely cared about her thoughts, not just waiting for his turn to speak. No man had ever treated her ideas as worthy of serious consideration before. By August, they were deeply in love, though neither had yet said the words. Marianne could feel it in the way Zachary looked at her, in the gentleness of his touch when he helped her down from her horse, in the way he always seemed to know what she needed before she asked. She knew she loved him by the way her heart lifted every time she saw him, by the way everything seemed brighter and more vivid when he was near, by the way she felt incomplete when he was not there. Her father had come around somewhat, seeing how happy Marianne was, though he still worried about her future with a man who owned nothing but a horse and a saddle. But Robert Turner was not a cruel man, and he could not deny the way his daughter glowed with happiness in a way she never had before. One Sunday in late August, Zachary took Marianne to a place he had discovered about an hour's ride from town, a small canyon where a spring fed into a pool surrounded by cottonwood trees and red rocks. It was a hidden oasis in the harsh Nevada landscape, cool and green and private. They dismounted and sat on the rocks by the water's edge, and Marianne noticed that Zachary seemed nervous, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a restless energy. "Is something wrong?" she asked, concerned. "No, nothing is wrong," he said quickly. Then he took a deep breath. "Marianne, I need to tell you something. I was not entirely honest with you about why I left Wyoming." Marianne's stomach tightened with apprehension. "What do you mean? My brother and we did not just disagree about keeping the ranch. We had a falling out, a bad one. He wanted me to marry the daughter of our neighbor, to combine the properties and make one bigger ranch. She was a nice enough girl, but I did not love her, and I told him so. He said love did not matter, that duty to the family was what mattered. We fought about it, said terrible things to each other. I left the next morning and have not been back since." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "I tell you this because I do not want there to be secrets between us. When I left Wyoming, I swore I would never marry unless it was for love, real love, the kind that makes everything else worthwhile. And Marianne, I love you. I know we have not known each other long, but I loved you from the moment I saw you lying on the ground after I carried you out of that fire, alive when you could have been dead. I loved you for fighting so hard to survive, for the way you looked at me like I was something more than just a drifting cowboy. I love you for your mind and your spirit and the way you make me want to be a better man." Tears streamed down Marianne's face, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have loved you since the moment you pulled me from the flames. You are the bravest, kindest, most honest man I have ever known, and I do not care what you own or what your past holds. I just want to be with you." Zachary pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and it was the first real kiss they had shared, all the previous ones having been chaste pecks on the cheek or hand. This was different, deep and passionate and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Zachary reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small box. "I do not have much money," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond chip. "But I saved up everything I could. Marianne Turner, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who cannot promise you riches but can promise you his whole heart for as long as he lives?" "Yes," Marianne said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed again. And in that hidden canyon with the sun filtering through the cottonwood leaves and the sound of water trickling over rocks, they pledged themselves to each other with a certainty that neither had ever felt about anything before. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in September, when the worst of the summer heat had passed. It was a small affair, held in Rawhide's little white church with just the townspeople in attendance. Marianne wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her smaller frame, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers like the ones Zachary had brought her that first dinner. Zachary wore a new suit that Robert Turner had insisted on buying for him, part of his grudging acceptance of the marriage. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Zachary kissed her in front of the whole town, Marianne felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They held a small reception in the church social hall, with cake and punch and dancing to music from a fiddler who was passing through town. Marianne danced with her father, both of them crying, and then with her new husband, who held her close and whispered in her ear about their future together. The question of where they would live had been solved when Samuel Donovan, the owner of Copper Creek Ranch, offered them a small cabin on the property. It was one of the line shacks, usually used by cowboys during roundup, but Donovan said they could fix it up and make it a proper home. Zachary would continue working as a ranch hand, and Marianne could help with the ranch accounts and possibly take in sewing or other work to supplement their income. They moved into the cabin the day after the wedding and spent the next week making it livable. It was tiny, just 2 rooms, but they cleaned and repaired and made simple furniture, and Marianne hung curtains she had sewn from feed sacks. She cooked their meals on a small iron stove, and they slept in a bed that Zachary had built with his own hands. It was a far cry from the comfortable apartment above the store where she had grown up, but Marianne had never been happier. Life on the ranch was hard work but satisfying. Zachary left before dawn most mornings and returned at dusk, exhausted but content. Marianne kept house and tended a small vegetable garden she had planted near the cabin, and helped Rosa with cooking for the ranch hands during busy seasons. In the evenings, she and Zachary would sit on the porch of their cabin and watch the sun set over the desert, turning the sky shades of orange and purple and red. They talked about everything, sharing their days and their dreams and their fears. Zachary told her more about his childhood in Wyoming, about his mother who had been strong and kind, and his father who had been stern but fair. Marianne told him about growing up without a mother, about the loneliness of being an only child and the pressure of being everything to her father. They learned each other's bodies as well as their minds, discovering the particular ways to bring each other pleasure, the touches and kisses that made breath catch and hearts race. By winter, Marianne suspected she might be pregnant, and by February it was confirmed. She told Zachary one evening over dinner, nervous about how he would react since they had barely been married 6 months and had almost no savings. But his face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he picked her up and spun her around despite her protests, and told her she had made him the happiest man alive. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though the summer heat made the last months uncomfortable. Marianne continued to work as long as she could, but by August, she had to admit defeat and spend most of her days resting in the cabin while Rosa and some of the other ranch women checked on her. Zachary was beside himself with worry, constantly fussing over her and asking if she was all right, if she needed anything, until Marianne finally had to tell him gently that he was driving her mad with his hovering. Their son was born in September 1883, exactly 1 year after their wedding, a squalling red-faced baby boy with dark hair and powerful lungs. They named him Matthew Thomas Zimmerman, and Zachary held him with such tenderness and awe that Marianne fell in love with her husband all over again. Her father came out to the ranch to meet his grandson and cried openly, and Marianne saw that he had finally accepted that his daughter had chosen the right man, even if he was not the one Robert would have picked. The next few years passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy. Matthew grew into a sturdy toddler who loved following his father around the ranch, and Marianne became pregnant again when he was 2, giving birth to a daughter they named Emily Margaret. Zachary proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful with the children, always making time for them no matter how tired he was from a long day's work. During this time, Zachary had been saving every penny he could, and he had been talking to Samuel Donovan about his dreams of eventually owning his own small piece of land. Donovan, who had become something of a mentor to the young cowboy, encouraged him and even offered advice on what to look for and how to manage livestock and water rights. In 1887, when Matthew was 4 and Emily was 2, an opportunity arose that would change their lives. An old rancher named Henry Walsh, who had a spread about 20 miles south of Rawhide, died without heirs, and his property was being sold to settle his debts. It was not a large ranch, only about 300 acres with a small house and barn, but it had good grazing and a reliable spring. The price was more than fair, and Samuel Donovan offered to loan Zachary the difference between what he had saved and what was needed, to be paid back over time. Marianne and Zachary discussed it for hours, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. They would be giving up the security of Zachary's steady wages at Copper Creek for the uncertainty of running their own operation. But they would also be building something for themselves and their children, something that could be passed down through generations. In the end, they decided to take the chance. They bought the Walsh property and moved their small family there in the spring of 1887. The house needed work, and the fences were in poor repair, and there was so much to do that some days Marianne wanted to cry from the overwhelming nature of it all. But they worked side by side, Zachary repairing buildings and Marianne painting and cleaning and planting a proper garden. They bought a small herd of cattle with the last of their savings and some chickens and a milk cow. The first year was brutally hard. There was a drought that summer that killed half their garden and left the grazing sparse. One of their cows died from a snake bite, and Matthew got sick with a fever that had Marianne praying harder than she ever had in her life. But they survived, and slowly, painfully, they began to build something real. By 1890, the ranch was turning a small profit. They had expanded the herd and hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work. Matthew was 7 now and helping with chores, and Emily was 5 and already showing signs of being as strong-willed as her mother. Marianne gave birth to another son that year, whom they named Samuel after their benefactor, and the Copper Creek Ranch owner cried when they told him. Robert Turner had grown older and frailer, and in 1892 he finally agreed to sell the general store and move out to the ranch with his daughter's family. He was 63 years old and tired, ready to rest after decades of hard work. He spent his last years playing with his grandchildren and helping Marianne with the household accounts. And when he died peacefully in his sleep in 1895, he was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch with a view of the desert he had called home for so long. Zachary and Marianne grieved his loss, but they also felt grateful that Robert had lived to see his daughter's life turn out so well, to see that the cowboy he had once worried about had indeed been the right choice, had given his daughter a life full of love and purpose and family. The years continued to roll by, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing of their children. Matthew grew tall and strong like his father, taking naturally to the work of ranching. Emily was fearless, able to ride before most girls her age and insisting on helping with the cattle even when her parents tried to steer her toward more traditional girls' work. Samuel was the quiet one, thoughtful and gentle, more interested in books than branding irons. In 1898, Marianne and Zachary celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. They were in their late 30s now, no longer the young couple who had fallen in love over a near tragedy, but their love had only deepened with time and trials. They knew each other completely, all the good and the bad, the strengths and the flaws, and they loved each other not despite these things but because of them. They were sitting on the porch of their ranch house one evening that summer, watching the sun set just as they had done in countless evenings before, when Zachary took her hand and said, "Do you remember the day I pulled you out of that fire?" "Every detail," Marianne said. "I remember thinking I was going to die, and then suddenly you were there, and everything changed." "I was so afraid I would be too late," Zachary admitted. "When I saw the mill burning, something told me to check if everyone had gotten out. And when someone said there was still a woman inside, I did not even think. I just ran. I found you collapsed on the floor, and my heart just stopped for a moment because I thought maybe you were already gone. Then you coughed, and it was like the world started again." "You gave me my life that day," Marianne said softly. "Not just by saving me from the fire, but by showing me what real love could be. Before you, I thought I was content, but I did not know what I was missing. You taught me that life could be an adventure, that love was not just a comfortable companionship, but a grand passion worth fighting for. You taught me that I was worth loving," Zachary said. "After I left Wyoming, I felt like a failure, like I had let my family down by not being willing to marry for duty. But you showed me that following my heart was not selfish, that real love between two people was worth more than all the land or money in the world. You made me believe in myself again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, watching as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. In the house behind them, they could hear their children getting ready for bed, Matthew helping Samuel with his reader while Emily chattered about the horse she wanted to break next week. "We built a good life," Marianne said. "We built the best life," Zachary corrected. "Not because it was easy or because everything went perfectly, but because we built it together. Every hardship, every joy, every ordinary day, together." "Together," Marianne agreed and leaned her head against his shoulder. The ranch continued to prosper in the years that followed. By the turn of the century, the Zimmerman Ranch was known throughout the region for its quality cattle and the integrity of its owners. Matthew took over more of the daily operations as Zachary's body began to feel the effects of decades of hard physical labor. Emily, to the shock of some of the more traditional families in the area, announced her intention to study veterinary medicine, a rare choice for a woman but one her parents supported fully. Samuel went east to college to study law, writing long letters home about his experiences in the wider world his mother had once dreamed of seeing. In 1905, Matthew married a girl from Rawhide named Clara, and they gave Zachary and Marianne their first grandchild, a boy named Zachary after his grandfather. Holding his tiny namesake in his arms, Zachary was overwhelmed with emotion, seeing the continuation of the family he and Marianne had created, the legacy that would outlast them both. Emily never married, but she became the best horse doctor in 3 counties, treating animals with the same fierce competence she brought to everything in her life. Samuel came back to Nevada after finishing school and opened a law practice in Rawhide, using his skills to help small ranchers and farmers fight the larger interests that tried to push them out. As they grew older, Zachary and Marianne spent more time on the porch, less involved in the daily work of the ranch, but always available with advice and love for their children and grandchildren. They spoke often of that day in 1882, when their lives had intersected through fire and smoke and fear. How that terrible moment had been the beginning of everything beautiful in their lives. Zachary's hair turned silver, and his hands grew gnarled from arthritis, but he still reached for Marianne every morning when they woke, and every evening when they went to bed. Marianne's face lined with wrinkles, badges of all the smiles and tears and years of sun. But when Zachary looked at her, he still saw the young woman he had pulled from the flames, beautiful and brave, and exactly who he had been meant to find. In the spring of 1915, Zachary became ill with pneumonia. Despite the doctor's best efforts and Marianne's devoted nursing, he grew weaker. Lying in their bed in the ranch house they had built together, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, he held Marianne's hand and said, "It has been the greatest honor of my life to be your husband. Every day with you was a gift." "Do not talk like that," Marianne said, tears streaming down her face. "You are going to get better. You have to get better." But they both knew he would not. Zachary died 3 days later on a bright spring morning with Marianne holding him. He was 58 years old, and he had lived 33 years as a married man, 33 years of the deepest love and partnership he could have imagined. Marianne grieved him with a depth that frightened her children. For weeks she barely ate, barely spoke, wandering the ranch like a ghost. She would sit on their porch alone, looking at the sunset, and talk to him as though he were still there. But gradually, with the help of her family and the passing of time, she began to heal. Not to forget, never to forget, but to carry her love for him forward into whatever time she had left. She lived another 12 years, staying active and involved in the ranch's operations and her grandchildren's lives. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the young cowboy who had run into a burning building to save a stranger, about how he had loved completely and without reservation, about how he had built a life with his own 2 hands that had been more valuable than any fortune. Marianne Turner Zimmerman died peacefully in her sleep in 1927, at the age of 67. She was laid to rest next to Zachary on the hill that overlooked the ranch, and all of Rawhide turned out for her funeral to honor the woman who had been the heart of one of the area's most respected families. Their children and grandchildren continued the ranch, each generation adding to what Zachary and Marianne had started. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to every new generation. The mill fire that could have been the end of Marianne's story had instead been the beginning of something greater, a love that had created not just a family, but a legacy of courage and commitment, and choosing each other every single day. On the hill where they were buried, someone planted a cottonwood tree that grew tall and strong, its leaves rustling in the Nevada wind. Their headstones were simple, bearing just their names and dates and one line that Matthew had chosen: "Together in life, together in eternity." And so the love story that began in fire and smoke, that was forged through hard work and sacrifice, and the everyday choices to stand beside each other through good times and bad, came to its close not as an ending but as a completion. They had lived fully and loved deeply, and they had shown everyone who knew them that real love was not just the passion of youth, but the partnership of two souls committed to building something that would outlast them both.